I am starting this guy off on Fawn Stonehenge paper. This is the one that you buy in the individual sheets. Oh, that's a nice bruise on my arm. This is the one that you buy on the individual sheets, not the padded paper. The one that comes in the padded paper has a more vellum finish, which is smoother and not to my taste, although I know lots of colored pencil artists who love it. So again, individual sheets. So what I'm doing here, I want my background to be slightly blurred and out of focus. So I'm overlapping my colors where I've got the browns and the greens. You can see that they're slightly layering on top of each other. I'm working in small circles, but I'm not being terribly careful, making sure that everything's perfectly smooth here, because I do want variation where some areas are darker and some areas are lighter. If I wanted this to be like a smooth, solid green, I would work in tiny, tiny circles and be really careful where I overlap everything so that it was very even. But again here, I definitely need some areas to be darker and lighter than others. And the key to making something look blurry or out of focus is pretty simple. You just don't add a lot of detail. The farther away that you want something to appear, the more blurry you're going to make it. Or less detail, I should say. The colors that I'm using, there's a lot of them, and they are listed below in the video description. I'm using both Luminance and Polychromos for this. And I'm not pushing down very hard. If you push down very hard with your pencils, you will flatten the tooth of the paper so that it won't take additional layers well. The reason that I chose to work with Stonehenge versus the Fabriano Artistico was on this one, I wanted everything to be so soft, and it's really easy on this paper to get everything very soft. Not that it can't be done with the Fabriano Artistico, it just seems to go a little bit easier with this stuff. And on the flip side, it's a little bit harder to get detail or fine detail with this paper than it is on the Fabriano. I spent about 2 days getting my background on here. So while it appears that it goes very fast, it is not. It is a slow, slow process. And one of the main reasons that I airbrush my background so often. But enough of you have been requesting me to do a background in colored pencil, so there you go. Remember, when you do your backgrounds, don't rush over them. You want to put as much detail and as much attention into them as you do every other part of your piece. If your subject looks amazing, but your background's kind of crappy because you rushed over it, the whole piece is going to be pulled down. You can see I've got several layers on there before I started blending with the paint thinner. I've got a lot of paint thinner on my brush at this point, really for everything on this piece. Unlike when I work in portraits where I have to be really careful about how much paint thinner is on my brush at any given time to get the smooth look of the skin. When doing animals, or in this case the background, it really is not very important. But I usually will use more paint thinner anyway for my first few layers. Now with the Stonehenge paper, I do find that I've got to make sure that that paint thinner is completely dry before I work over it with the colored pencil. Otherwise, I will damage the tooth of the paper. The Stonehenge is very, very soft compared to the Fabriano Artistico. With the Fabriano Artistico, I do wait, but I don't have to be as careful. If it's not all the way dry, the paper is generally going to be fine. With the Stonehenge, I've really got to be more careful. So I probably had, I'd say 4 or 5 layers of colored pencil layering on top of each other on that section before I blended it the first time with paint thinner. One of the most common questions that I get from people is that they're not getting the color saturation quite like I do with their backgrounds, or when they blend in general. They expect the paint thinner to be like a magic solution that makes everything look like a painting. And it will, but it's something that is slow going. You have to add so many layers to get it to that point. This is not a fast medium to work in, which is one of the benefits, because you don't really have to rush. There's no dry time that you're fighting. You can see as I continue to work, I start each layer, and each time I add more pencil, I start losing that crayon look as I move along. But the first few layers, and then the first time blending with the paint thinner, it'll generally still look like a 5-year-old did it. That has that crayon effect. And that is very normal. I'm still using a fairly light hand. Blending it out with the paint thinner again. Remember, when you're using your paint thinner, leave the lid on it unless you're actually using it that second. While it is odorless, it is still toxic, and I recently had a student who mentioned that she was getting headaches from it, but she was leaving the lid off of it the whole time she was working. So just leave the lid on it, and more likely than not, you won't have any issues. At least I don't, and I'm pretty sensitive to toxic things. Everything gives me a headache, but this stuff doesn't. But again, I leave the lid on it. So what I do for my backgrounds, when I'm choosing something to use, I go through one of the royalty-free sites. Morgue File is a great one for backgrounds like this. And I choose a photo, I pull it into Photoshop, and then I just add a blur over it to get an idea of what it would look like. So it still looks like a jungle, but it doesn't have all of the detail, because it can be hard to look at a photo that does have a lot of detail and be able to judge how to blur it. How would that look if it was actually blurry? It's easy to say don't add detail, but it's a lot harder to actually do. So if you can use Photoshop, or really any photo editing app, if you've got a smartphone, chances are there's plenty of apps on there that will allow you to do this. I just add a blur over it, and I do have a video showing you how to do that. If you do a search on YouTube, if you just type in Lachri and how I use Photoshop, it'll come up on there. I'd say I'd leave a link, but I keep forgetting to do that for you guys, so I'll just tell you how to search for it yourself. So I'm using white here to pull out different highlights. It's really important to have a lot of different values in your background so that you don't end up with a piece that looks very flat. Blending that with the paint thinner again. I found working on the Fawn Stonehenge paper, it's really obvious where the paint thinner has touched the paper, whereas on the white, you can't really see the dark. It almost looks like an oil stain. When it dries, that little mark does go away completely, though. Now, as I work, I get each section, like I kind of block off which section I'm working on, and I try to get that section done most of the way before I move on. But I still will start spreading out and then go back and work on this section. For example, here, I'm adding the browns and the greens here, but I'm not completely done with that left-hand corner. I will come back, but it gets to the point where it's hard for me to judge my values and to tell how much more detail, see, I'm back to it already, until I get some of those other colors, the darker areas around it in. And when I use that white pencil, I'm usually adding a bit more pressure to it than I do any other pencil. I'm almost burnishing here so that it really stands out. But I also saved it for my final layers. So if I do damage the paper, it's no big deal. At this point anyway. The paper under my hand is glassine, Glassine, and I got that on Amazon. It's pretty inexpensive for a roll of it, and it is the best thing to keep my hand from smudging the work as I go along. One of the things that I found working on Stonehenge is that everything smudges really easily, which is great when you're wanting that smooth blending, but not so great when you're trying to keep paper clean. So I had another artist suggest I use this stuff, and it is amazing. I used to use tracing paper, but the tracing paper can pick up some of the colored pencil as well, which was never a problem when I used Fabriano Artistico, but I started having that problem with Stonehenge. So this has been a lifesaver. You can see I just layer on top of layer on top of layer. And I had never worked on the fawn colored Stonehenge before, or really fawn paper at all. The reason that I chose this for this piece is I just wanted to see if I liked it or not. I didn't find that there was a huge difference over using white with this. I think I prefer white a little bit more because it's easier for me to judge my values, but that may just be because I'm so used to working on white paper. But the Stonehenge is pretty inexpensive, so I bought a few sheets. So you guys will see me try it out a few more times before I judge whether or not I really want to purchase more in that color or not. The nice thing about it was that it was really easy for me to see where I had laid down my white. Like on the leopard, I put white down for the whiskers to protect that area, and it was so easy to see, which is not something you really get when you're working with solid white. You can see again, I've got so many layers on here, and it looks like crayon until I come on top of it with the paint thinner. Even then, it'll still look a bit like paint thinner until I put more layers. And I'm being pretty messy. I'm not worried about copying my reference photo exactly. I just wanted to get an idea of what a blurry jungle would look like. But if my trees are slightly off or my lights and darks are slightly off, no one is going to notice the difference. I don't think that sort of thing is that important. So I'm not going to waste tons of time making sure everything is exact. I get more picky when I move on to the leopard. You can see I'm pulling in some of those lighter areas and defining the edge of the leopard's ear. Make sure when you're working around a subject like this, go right up against the subject. Make sure your background line completely touches your subject line. You don't want to end up with a glow around it. And this is something that I see a lot where people are afraid to mess up their subject, so they don't move all the way up to the subject and they have this light, well, a glow. So make sure to watch out for that. I'm still using a pretty light hand for this section. And blending out with paint thinner. Again, here I got it to where I felt it was pretty much done before I moved on, but I ended up coming back and making so many adjustments later on. So even if you think it's your final layer, it may not be. So again, be very, very careful not to push too hard on that paper until you're sure it's your last layer. This was one of those cases where I was so glad I had so many pencils to choose from because I used so many different greens on this background. And when you're working on something like this, it doesn't really look good as you're working on it. That's normal. Were so many times as I did this that I kept thinking, oh, I should just start over. This looks terrible. But you just have to keep layering, keep working on it. It'll get out of that ugly stage. For the tree, I'm being very messy, very scribbly almost, where I'm making a lot of vertical lines instead of the small circles because I do want that texture in that tree. The way that you apply your pencil, whether it be in small circles or longer vertical lines like that, it all depends on the look that you're going for. The way that you're holding it, the way that you're putting the pencil down, that will all affect what your final outcome looks like. And here especially, this would have been an area if I had not blurred out my reference photo so I had an idea of what that would look like there. There is no way. I would have felt so lost as I was working on those leaves on the bottom section, that bottom right-hand corner. It's such a weird blob. It almost looked like camouflage to me as I was working on it. So that would have been an absolute disaster had I not had a blurry photo to look at. If you're using Photoshop, you'll just go to your filters and then scroll down to blur. And I use one, it's Gaussian or Glossian, I can't say it, blur. And you can adjust how blurry you want it from there. So I'm about 3 layers in on this half of the paper at this point. 3 or 4 layers. The bottom right-hand corner has the least amount of layers at this point. And now I'll blend that with paint thinner. And on these first layers, I'm pushing pretty hard with that brush too. I'm almost scrubbing it onto the paper to really get the colored pencil color dissolved right into all of the little grains of the paper. I am not using a light hand for this. When I'm doing a portrait and I'm on those final layers, I do adjust how much pressure I'm adding when I add the paint thinner, but here I get to be very, very messy. You do want to watch, for example, I have a light area right above the ear on the right hand side. I don't want to blend over the tree, that dark tree, and then smudge it over the light area because I would smudge the brown into that. So I want to make sure that I blend that separately, and I've got a paper towel. I use Viva paper towels whenever I'm using oil paint or paint thinner. They work unlike any other type of paper towel. If you don't have one of those, you can use an old t-shirt. But I wipe the brush into the paint thinner and then wipe it off on that paper towel to get any of the dark coloring off of the brush, to clean it off before I blend the white areas. That way I don't make a muddy mess. While I'm waiting for the paint thinner to dry in between layers, I will usually sit there, and that's the point that I'll go and check social media and make any posts that I want to or reply to people. Once I get this background mostly done, I will take a photo of it, load it into Photoshop right next to my reference photo so I can compare my values better. Do I need to go lighter or darker? I'm not so much worried about details still. I just want to make sure that I've got it as light or dark as I designed in my original design. You can see as I'm layering this, I'm not trying to cover up all of what I had underneath. I'm letting some of those light areas of those greens show through. That is a huge part of what creates depth in that piece. If I just made one solid color, it'll look very flat. So I don't want to take that green and cover all of the light greens. One of the nice things when you're working with greens, all shades of green look good with all other shades of green. Nice design tip too when you're using green in your home. That's not the case with all colors. For example, if I were using blue, mixing cool and warm blues together don't look very good. And I know you're thinking blue, it's all cool. It's not. If you've got like a bluish green mixed with a purplish blue, it doesn't look very good together in most cases. There are rare exceptions, I'll mix them, but they're pretty rare. With green, I can use every single green in my box and it is all going to look good next to each other. And if you're doing this and you're coming up with areas that are coming up too fluorescent greens and you want to tone it down, use its complementary color to tone it down. In this case with green, that means red. And later on, I did come back through, and I'm not sure that showed in the video. I may have done that when the camera was off, but I did come back through on certain areas and add a reddish brown over several parts just to tone the green down so it wasn't too green. And that's going to be true with anything. If you've got an orange that's too fluorescent, add a bit of blue to it, and that'll give you a more grayish brown tone. With yellow, you would add purple, or if your purple's too bright, add yellow, and it'll give you a more brownish neutral tone. Whether you're painting or drawing with trees, that is a big thing when you're trying to get like more of an olive natural color. you're almost always going to mix your red and green together. I'm taking this lighter color and washing it over everything. So it's almost like a glaze in painting where you can still see what's underneath it, but because I'm washing it over everything, it makes everything more blurred together. It softens everything up. Plus, by lightening that up, that is going to make the black leopard stand out that much more once I get to that part. That camera does not want to focus. When I'm working on that trait, I am mostly, again, working in vertical lines to keep that texture in the trunk. Going over everything with paint thinner because I had recently added that lighter color over everything, so it needed to be blended out everywhere. I'm still using a lot of paint thinner on my brush. Here I am again coming back through with more of the lighter areas. I'm pushing a little bit harder on the paper, but I'm still not flattening the tooth out completely. Not actually burnishing here. You have to be careful. It's so easy. I had to watch myself on this. I want to start adding detail, but if you're going for that soft background, resist. I wanted to add branches and define the leaves better, and you really can't if you're going for a fuzzy out of focus background. Once I got the leopard in, I was able to stop wanting to adjust the background or add more detail in the background. But when that's all you've got on the paper, it is so easy to want to keep adding detail. So I'm not sure how many layers in I'm at this point, but it is a lot. I'm using this yellowy green to make the colors a bit richer. And notice how I'm pulling a lot of these colors right over the tree trunks that are in the background as well. That softens everything up and pushes it all back. When you're doing these blurry backgrounds, you don't have to keep your pencils quite as sharp as you might normally. So you can keep working with the same pencil down to pretty much a nub before you have to sharpen it again. At least if you're blending with paint thinner. If you are not blending with paint thinner and you're just going to be burnishing, you're probably going to want your pencil to be sharper then so that you can get it into all the little crevices of the paper. So just because something is blurry and doesn't have a lot of detail doesn't mean it's not going to take just as much time as something that does have a lot of detail, because you still have to add just as many layers, and each of those layers is just time consuming. Yay, finally onto the leopard. I am starting with his ears. And I've listed the colors that I used on the leopard separate from the colors that I used on the background. And oh, there were so many. And what I'm doing is just basically blocking in my main shapes, my lights and my darks, so that I know where everything goes. I will come back through later and refine details even more. Then making sure that if I have sketchy lines, they do go in the right direction along with that fur. So this is where you start really paying close attention to your reference photo. And I don't want that black to just be solid black. So you can see I've switched to a gray, and I'm fading the black of the inside of the ear out to that gray. Now, here's the thing with black animals, and this is where a lot of people struggle. They're not all black. There's actually very little black that you're going to use in a black animal. You're going to use so many other colors. If the animal has a shiny coat at all, it reflects so many colors. So So don't go crazy with your black to start off with. You can see I'm not really worried about detail at this point at all. Blending that out with paint thinner. You can see the first time I blend something with paint thinner, I've still got that gritty, grainy look. That's normal. It's going to take so many layers to get rid of that. It also looks like I'm working straight onto wet paper. I'm not. I did take a break and let that dry before I started adding more detail on top of it. Using the white pencil to add some of those little hairs. Now, if I needed those hairs to be truly, really, really white, I would have used white paper to start with. I wouldn't have used fawn. But I would have also put those down first so that the paper stayed really white. Here, I just need them to be lighter. I don't need them to be actually white, so I can lay them on top of the darker colors I already have down. So the second time blending with paint thinner, you can see I've lost most of that grainy, gritty look. Now while that dries, I will move on and work on this ear. That first ear is not finished, not even close. I just need to let the paper dry. I find that the paper, the Fabriano Artistico, the paint thinner dries faster on that stuff than it does on the Stonehenge. The Stonehenge is softer, so I'm not sure if it's just absorbing more or what the deal is there. Remember, when working in colored pencil, it is always better to go lighter than you think you're going to need to be and darken up as you move along. If you go too dark too early on, it can be really difficult to lighten areas back up. And blending that out with paint thinner. And while that ear dries, I'm moving back to the other one to start adding more detail. When I'm deciding which black that I want to use, whether it be the Luminance or the Polychromos, it generally comes down to if I'm going for more detail. If I need tons of tiny detail, and if I wanted a darker, richer black, I will go with the Polychromos. The Luminance I switch to when I want really, really soft blending. You'll see for the most part on this piece, I stick with my Polychromos black. I'm not going to go too crazy adding the white hairs in at this point because those are just kind of blockers, so I know approximately where they're going to go. I'm going to have to come back through later on and add a lot more detail with those hairs. Now watch when you do the inside of animal ears. They're not just a solid black color, and that's something that I see people do a lot. You've got a lot of detail in there. Make sure to pay attention to all of that detail. And blending with paint thinner. The brush that I'm using is a taklon bristled Filbert that came in a really cheap set from Hobby Lobby. I want to say it's just under $10 for a set of a whole bunch of different brushes, and that one brush is the one that I use more often than not. You do not need expensive brushes when you're blending with paint thinner like this. But I do like the taklon bristled brushes. The texture, the firmness of the brush is just perfect for me. And I will occasionally switch to smaller brushes when I'm blending teeny tiny little details like inside the eyes. And you can see that the white actually shows up really well against the darks that I have there. It's not completely white though. But again, I didn't want totally white, so it was perfect for this. Had I wanted white, I would have needed to get all those hairs down first in white before I added the darks. And that is the Luminance white for that. The Polychromos white wouldn't show up at all. It's a pretty useless pencil actually. The only thing that I can think of where the Polychromos white comes in handy is if I'm burnishing. I can use it almost like a colorless blender because color does not come out of that thing. Moving on to the eye, I am back to my Polychromos black. You can see that it is very, very sharp, so I can get the fine detail that I need. And what you can't really see on these videos is I am pausing constantly and looking at my reference photos. I spend more time looking at the reference photo than I do actually drawing. Now the shine in this guy's eye is not totally white, so I didn't need to put down white first. I was able to get my darks in, and then I will layer white on top of it so that I have a highlight, but it's just more of a gloss, a glare, not an actual white spot. So I'm blocking in the color first. I will come back through later and add more details with the little lines. I just want a base color for now. And this eye is a bit darker than the other eye. One of the things that I had a bit of a problem with on this, and you'll notice it more later, because I blocked in both eyes before I finished off this side of the face, I started working on the other side of the face, which in the end, it made it look like this eye was really, really big, and it was just throwing me off until I came back and blocked in this side of the face. Sometimes you'll have things like that happen where it's just an illusion. The drawing was right. It was accurate. It was just that because of what I had outlined on the one side, it made it appear to be bigger than the other side. So blending that out with a paint thinner, and you can see I'm using a much smaller brush here. Got a bit of blue for the underline of the eye, and that blue and that purple, well, you're not seeing the purple yet, but I will be using a purple. There's the purple. I used those so much on the black fur as well. You can see there are so many colors in that eye. It's really easy to look at something and go, oh yeah, those are yellow eyes, and just want to draw them all, color them in all in yellow, and that's rarely the case. There's just so many colors and so much detail that you want to pay attention to. And here, where the eyes technically look gold, there's very little yellow in them. I'll end up layering some more yellow on top of them to brighten them later, but they're mostly greens and grays. More gray than anything else. You can see I've got it slightly darker right under that upper lid. And there is my white reflection. Now here I have to really start paying attention to the direction of my pencil lines. They have got to follow the direction of the fur and the length of the fur. This is where I start paying really close attention to all of that. And at this point, everything just looks like a sketch. I'm not really trying to get the solid coverage here. I'm just blocking in, making sure I know what direction all of the fur goes in. And the approximate color, I will adjust all of my values and colors later. I just need to go for semi-close right now. This isn't a stage where I want to worry about all of the details being exact. That will come later. But I do want to get some of this blocked in. That lighter luminance blue that I use around the eyes, and I'll use it in some of the coat later on. That one, I switched to that blue versus a Polychromos blue, not so much because of the color, but because of how opaque the Polychromos pencils are. I'm sorry, the Luminance pencils. The Luminance pencils are more opaque, and so where I really want it to show up, that I will switch over to those. And then that darker blue is a Polychromos blue, which I use almost like if I were glazing and painting, where it's translucent enough that I can layer it on top of other colors without losing the detail that I had previously applied with the other colors. And the biggest thing I hear from people about the problems that they're having when they're drawing black animals is that they look very flat. And that's usually because you're just using too much of one color. Look at all of the colors, even now how many colors I have. And that's not all the colors I'll end up using. There are so many values and so many colors that I use to create the black fur. And everywhere where I add black, I don't leave it solid black. I'll end up adding reds and purples and blues on top of it so that I get that richness and it doesn't feel flat. It also makes the black appear to be darker, which is an added bonus. Now, as you're working, you can see I keep jumping around. Do what is easier for you. If it is easier for you to focus on 1 square inch at a time so it doesn't get so overwhelming, do that. For me, this is easier for me to judge my values if I kind of jump around, work on a little area over here, and then go back to a previous area. Because I keep losing my place if I don't have some of the other areas blocked in. But you need to find out which is easier for you. There's no one right or wrong way. It's going to come down to how your brain works, how your brain is seeing things. I think part of the reason that I jump around as much as I do is I came from being a painter working with acrylics and oils before I really started focusing on colored pencil. And so my brain still works in the layering process like it does with painting. With painting, I would have painted the entire leopard a dark color and then started layering another color over the entire leopard. I don't work in one small area on painting at all. But don't think because this is how I do it that it's the only way. You'll notice the hairs on the bridge of the nose. Those are really, really short, but you still need to follow the direction that your reference photo is showing. And I don't want to have too many lines, like actual defined lines on the bridge of the nose, or it ends up making it look like that hair is wiry and kind of long and weird. Not the look I want here. I want this to look very sleek. Using that violet gray by the Luminance for the bridge of the nose there. And on the reference photo, that appears to be just solid white. It looks so, so bright. It's not. It looks like it's white because when it's up against the dark colors around it, that contrast seems so high that it appears to be white, but it really isn't. So this is, again, one of those cases where it's pretty handy if you can use the eyedropper tool in Photoshop or some other photo editing app. It'll give you a better idea of the values that you need to go with. Now, I also ended up blending this a little bit darker than I'm going to need to go on the bridge there so that I can come back through with a white pencil and add a few individual hairs on top of it, which will brighten it up, but if I went too light to begin with, I wouldn't be able to get those hairs easily. Right now he kind of looks like a rainbow cat, but that will all work its way out in the end. So you can see here with the white, I'm defining the brush strokes or the little pencil lines for the hairs there. If I didn't have that dark, dark color down first, these little lines wouldn't show up well. But I don't want to overdo it because I don't want it to look like it's solid white. And I'll end up going back over it with blues and purples later to tone it down even more. So here is where you can see, this was what was throwing me off on the eyes. Look how much larger the eye on the left appears to be than the eye on the right. It's just because of the way that I have the eye lined there. It's drawn correctly. I kept checking my work, measuring it, and it was drawn correctly. It just, I didn't have my values correct yet. So this is one of those things, had I not known for absolute certain that that was drawn correctly before I started and I hadn't checked my measurements again and again and again, I probably would have tried to make that eye on the right bigger, which would have been wrong. When I come back through and darken everything up and then finish the other side of the face, that got rid of that illusion. But you want to be able to trust that your drawing is right in the first place so that you don't mess things up when you do have an illusion like this happen. This is one of the most severe illusions I've had happen on any given piece that I've worked on in a long time. So even me knowing it was drawn right, it was still a little bit hard for me to trust that it was right and not try to fix the drawing. I'm not finished with any of those parts on the face, but I wanted to start blocking in the nose. So I'm kind of doing dots and little half circles and smudges in there to get the texture of the nose. And this is something where I don't need to copy the photo exactly. I don't need every little tiny, tiny dot in the same place. I just need to create the look of texture there. Now, when you're deciding which area of the piece that you want to work on, whether it be the background or the foreground or an ear, an eye, with colored pencil, you're pretty free to work on any area that interests you, but I usually tell people start with your background first, because once we get our subject finished, we usually get bored with it and don't want to put the time needed into the background, and it's so easy to try to rush over the background thinking it's not that important. So when you start a new piece, if you start with the background, get that part out of the way, have it all completely done, it just makes it a lot easier for you not to rush over it and kind of mess that part up. But if you really, really want to work on your subject first, you can. You're not fighting a dry time like you are with painting, so it doesn't matter which area you work on first as far as what the final results are, as long as you know that you're going to have the patience to put the time needed into your background. Some artists will work on the background and the subject at the same time, which is also an option. I don't enjoy doing backgrounds very much myself, so I like to get that part out of the way first. Plus, I think it goes back to, as a painter, I always started with my background, so my mind just works that way. So loosely blocking in the chin. I don't need this to be perfect because I'm going to come back through with a lighter pencil once the areas under the chin are blocked in to get all those little hairs. You can see here how well the white shows up against the fawn paper. So that was one thing that was pretty nice about working on this slightly tinted paper. I felt like I had a little bit more of a hard time judging my greens though, because everything felt weird up against that, just because I'm so used to working up against white. And that is not black, that is a brown color. Pencil looks like it's black. That one's black. Notice how sharp I'm keeping the pencils at this point. There's such tiny detail in there. It is really important to keep those pencils sharp when you're working on little areas. You want to make sure that the little details that you're putting in there are correct or in the right spot. You don't want to just put random lines all over the place for the sake of details. The details won't make your work look more realistic if they're inaccurate. One thing that I did find working on the black fur is that it takes a lot longer for me than working on, say, a tiger. Getting the color saturation that dark in some of those areas, and I had to keep layering black and then blue and purple and red. I had to layer so many colors to get my blacks truly black where I wanted them and to get all of these darks in there that it did take a little bit longer than when I work on lighter colored animals. Adding a bit of the fur on the chin, but I'm still going to have to come back through later and get more detail there. You can see I've added that blue into the black, which gives it so much more depth, and red. Here it was really important to pay attention to the direction of those pencil lines. I'm blocking in the darker areas first, and then I'm lightly going over it with the same black pencil, but I've added a bit more pressure on the really dark areas. I'm taking that brown and I went right over the blue as well. Well, that's a bad camera angle. There we go. Now notice over the whiskers, I'm working in between those white whiskers. If a little bit of color gets on them, it's no big deal because they don't need to stay white, but I'm never going to get them light enough if I go really dark over those. By putting the white down first, that helps protect the paper too from the black staining it when I blend with the paint thinner. And I have people ask me all the time, how do you know which color to use? Well, there's the Photoshop trick, which There's the Photoshop trick that I've shown you guys on the a video I talked about earlier. But the other thing is some of it is experience, and honestly, for me, I don't worry that much about it. Some people will be so fussy about the color being exact. For me, it's all about the values. As long as I've got my values right, my colors can be really weird and really off, and it's probably going to be okay. So I don't stress myself out too much about it to start with, and I think that helps. But again, go focus on your values. But the Photoshop eyedropper trick, I always have my computer right next to me as I work. That is just priceless. And if you're using an iPad or a tablet of some sort, there are plenty of apps on there with an eyedropper tool within their photo editors that will allow you to touch a certain area and it'll pull up a little color wheel showing you where on that color wheel the color you're pointing at is. So it makes it easier to tell, okay, is that gray? Is it blue? What color goes there? But don't stress yourself out too much about it. Stress yourself out about the values if you're going to stress out about something, but not so much with the color. And on this guy, I was keeping the blues as I worked. I wanted it to be similar to my reference photo, but once I was finished and I took photos of it, the blues and the purples looked more vibrant on the computer than my original did. So I went back into my original and pulled out even more blues and purples. So mine is way more blue and purple than the reference photo was, but I just liked how that looked. This is where it's really handy to have some sort of photo editor like that as well, where I was able to load it into Photoshop, adjust my contrast, and brighten up my color saturation so I could see, do I want more blue or do I want to tone that down? It's much easier to adjust that in a photo editor to find out if you like something a certain way than to do it on the original and find out that it was a bad idea. I do not miss the art pre-Photoshop days. So now that I've blocked in a lot of the darks, you can see that the eyes are pretty much the right. I'm not finished with the eye on the right, but you can see that the shape, the size is much better, whereas before it seemed like the eye on the left was huge. I had an artist once tell me that you should always make the eyes on your subject a little bit bigger than they should be. I think that is the worst advice in the history of the world. Okay, maybe there's worse advice out there, but I think it's pretty bad advice because it makes your work look like a cartoon if you oversize your eyes. It's cute, but it's also not going to be realistic. So if you're going for realistic, make sure that the size, all of those little details needs to be very accurate. So coming back through on the bridge of the nose, I'm adding some of those short little fur hairs. I'm not going too crazy with those though. I'm just continuously building up that detail. And again, I am spending so much time looking at my reference photo. And this is an area, especially around the bridge of the nose, paying attention to which direction that fur goes is so huge. You can see how it twists and turns in all different directions. And if you miss that, it will not look right in the end. You can see with that Luminance pencil how sharp those pencils get. Even though they're a wax-based pencil, they can get so much great detail compared to the Prismacolor that I had used before. Now, if you are using Prismacolor, you guys know I'm not a fan of Prismacolors in general, but if you are using Prismacolor, if that's all you got, don't think that you can't get this much detail. You can, it's just a lot harder. I don't want you to give up thinking it's not possible, because it is. Now, I'm not going to work on all of the body at this point. I'm just blocking in a little bit of it so that I can judge the values better on the face. Notice too the areas where I have a lot of blue and then I'm putting the black over it, or I put the blue back over the black again, how rich and deep that black is versus the areas like on the chin where I don't have a lot of blue or purple yet and that black looks very flat. Layering color on top of your black makes a huge difference in how rich that color comes out. It may seem that something is going to look more black if you just use black, but that's generally not going to be the case. If you want something to be very, very dark, adding the blues, reds, and purples on top of it will give you a much richer, blacker look. You just add a lot of depth to it. And even though those eyes are really very gray, once I get the black around them, look how much greener and brighter they look. The colors that you are using next to another color will completely affect how that first color looks. Which is part of why I like to jump around so much. You can see I'm adding red right on top of that black there, which again pulls out more of the richness. When you add the individual lines for the hair, don't overdo it. You're not trying to put in every single hair. It won't look right if you do. It'll look really wiry. I'm just putting in some of those individual hairs. If you've got pets at home, look at them. Notice that when you look at them, you don't see each individual hair. You see clumps of shadows of lights and darks. And it's going to be the same when you do art. You'll put in some clumps of hair or some strands, but don't overdo that. Here you can see I'm using that lighter luminance blue, and it stands out really nice against the darker black colors. If I used a lighter Polychromos blue, you wouldn't see much of it. It's too translucent, which is great when you're trying to get more of a glazing look, but not so much here where I need it to show up against black. So I'm using black here to block in the darkest shadow on the forehead. Aren't you glad I said on the forehead? You would have had no idea I was working on the forehead had I not mentioned that. I say pointless things a lot. Now I've got that reddish brown color that I am layering over most of the rest of that and the blue. And I'm back to having it look like a children's coloring book. That is totally normal for this stage where you get your first layers. You can see I went way lighter than I was going to need to go. I still will have to come back and darken it even more. But I want to be careful not to overdo that in the first place. And here, it's weird because the fur there is so dense, you're not really seeing so much of the individual strands of fur. You're going to see more of those little sketchy lines closer to the eye and when you get down onto the cheek and the neck. But up here on the forehead, it's more of a solid, soft look because of that fur being so soft and dense up there. So this is another area where you want to pay attention to your reference photo and not just think you have it memorized. And now he looks like a clown leopard. Adding purple over some of the black on the forehead. Pulling that into the ear as well. So I am 3 or 4 layers in, I would say, at this stage. And then I'll come through with a paint thinner. And again, I've got a lot of paint thinner on my brush at this point, and I can be pretty messy. It doesn't matter what smudges into what. But notice, again, this looks terrible at this layer, but it's supposed to. So as you're working, don't look at your work and think, oh my gosh, I'm doing this wrong. It looks terrible. I'm going to give up. Keep working on it. Keep layering until you get there. Colored pencil can be a bit frustrating because it is one of the slowest mediums, if not the slowest medium to work in. So it takes a long time to get out of those ugly stages sometimes. But definitely do not give up on your piece and think starting over is going to help, because then you're still going to be back to having to start with those ugly stages again. But even me, with the amount of experience I have those moments where I'm like, oh, I messed this up. This isn't going to look good. This is never going to be good enough. You just have to work through it. One of the things that I like to do when I hit a really ugly stage is post a photo of it on social media. Then I feel more pressure to hurry up and move through that stage, get to where it looks good so I can post the good picture so that everyone doesn't think I'm terrible. Little game I play with myself. So here you can see I'm starting to pay a little bit more attention to the direction of that pencil line. The hair is a little bit longer there. Then back up to the softer fur. It's more just little circles I'm working in. And second time blending that out with paint thinner. You can see my colors are much richer, much darker, much closer to what they're going to be. Now, my purple area on the very top of the head is way darker than I need to be, but I'm going to come back on top with the light to soften that out and blend it up, but I need the purple there first so that I get a nice smooth transition between those colors. Got the violet gray there. One of my absolute favorite pencils. That one's by Luminance. And I used that almost as much as I used their white. I don't think I've ever done a piece since I started using Luminance that did not have violet gray in it. Or gray violet. I forget how it's worded on theirs. You can see now that I have all those darks in there, it's really easy for me to layer the lighter colors on top and they show up quite nicely. But because I don't want them to be white, doing the dark first and then putting light on top, which is backwards from what I normally say to do with colored pencil, but it works really well for this when you're doing the dark fur like that. Because again, I don't want white. If you are just using Polychromos, don't do it that way because your lighter colors won't show up against your dark colors well. The wax-based pencils tend to be more opaque, so you get that, you can get the light to show up against the dark, even though it's not really too white. So now that I'm moving on to the side of the face here, you can see that I've got to pay much closer attention to the direction of the fur. Okay, apparently I'm not moving along too far. Back to the forehead. Letting the white pencil show up more there. But really notice the difference between here and when I move on to the rest of the face. How I've applied that to where it's more solid, soft clumps versus the individual strands of fur that I'll end up getting later on. Notice too, see that kind of halo around the top of the forehead there? That I'm going to have to come back through and pull greens in to make that meet the leopard. I did not come down far enough there, so I've got to go back and fix that so I don't have that outline. I do want it lighter there, just not that light. Back up to the ear, adding detail. I never finished that. Now that I've got all of the darks in the face, it stood out more to me that I need to go way darker inside the ear there. Getting the glassine under my hand so I don't smudge my background. You can see how the direction of the fur moves and changes as I work my way down. For me, if I look at one area for too long, I start to lose it. I don't really see the detail anymore and I start missing things. So if I can stop, take a break, walk away from the piece, or in my case, because I have to get so much work done every week, I will work on another area. That's an added bonus to jumping around like I do. Then when I look back up at the previous little zone, it makes it a lot more obvious what needs to be changed. But if you don't want to do that, if you want to keep working on one area, just get up and walk away from the piece for a while. Give your eyes a break. Another tip that I found helps is if I've got the TV on, if I'll put a movie on, usually it's Harry Potter, but if I can put a movie on while I'm working and continuously glance up at the TV, that will give my eyes a break as well. And then when I come back and look back at the project that I'm working on, then it's easier for me to see details and see things that I may need to adjust. Plus, it's just good for your eyes to continuously look across the room, because if you look too close, if you're up close to your work, if you continuously look that close at one thing, it's not the healthiest thing for your eyes. Now I normally just listen to audiobooks as I work, but I have to remind myself to keep looking across the room. That glassine you can use over and over again. I've been using that same sheet for about 3 different pieces now. Until it gets wrinkled and messed up enough, I'll just keep using the same one. But because the colors don't stick to it, I don't have to worry about colors from a previous piece smudging onto a new one. With the tracing paper, I did have to switch in between pieces. Pulling out that richer red in the forehead there. And some purple. Now when I'm layering, like here with where I was with the purple, I didn't really have to worry too much about my brush strokes. I was mostly going in small circles, but because I'm using such a light hand, you're not really going to see those at this stage anymore anyway. Those first stages, the direction that those pencil lines go will make a big difference. But here, where it's such a translucent color, and I'm just almost like a glaze I would do with paint, I'm just tinting that color, it's not as big of a deal. The more work that you can play, the easier it'll get for you to judge where you can be lazy like that. Little time savers. That green is the ink eraser by Faber-Castell. And that will erase colored pencil far better than any other eraser. The ones here in the US have a cream colored casing. The one that I'm using is from Mexico, and that's got that lime green. But the eraser itself is the same. The more black that I add, you're able to see now how much more gold the eyes look, even though the eyes are pretty much gray and green. It becomes more and more obvious or it starts looking more and more like they're yellow, the more black and purples that I get in. It was right about this stage I lost the desire to rip up the piece and start over again, where it started to really come together. So I've blocked in the areas that would have the spots with the black first so that I don't lose my place there. And then I went over all of that with purple and blue. I needed it to fade from blue closer to the eye out to purple, and I'll come back through with magenta as well. And if you're having a hard time figuring out which colors to use, again, you've got the eyedropper tool you can use with Photoshop, but also have a scratch piece of paper, and that scratch piece of paper should be whatever paper you're currently working on, just a side piece of that, because the type of paper you're using will make a difference. I wouldn't want to test, for example, this on the Fabriano and expect it to look the same when I switch it over to the Stonehenge. But test the colors, because the order that you layer things will make a big difference too. If I put down magenta first and blue on top of it, it's going to look very different than if I put blue down first and magenta on top of that. So having a scratch piece of paper where you can test all of those out before you hit your paper will put a lot less pressure on you and makes it a lot easier to judge what colors you want. But again, don't stress yourself out too much about your colors. If you're going to stress yourself out, do it over the values, how light or dark something is, more so than the color. In which color you should choose is going to come, and it will get to where it's much easier for you to decide which color you need with experience. I am probably, at this point, I'd say about 5 or 6 layers in before I started blending with paint thinner. I knew this needed to be really dark and really rich, and so I just kept layering and layering and layering. Very light hand on each of those layers until I got it pretty dark. The nice thing with colored pencil, when you blend separate sections together, or work in separate sections, no matter what blending technique you're using, the colored pencil blends really well from one section to another. So you can see where I had done the muzzle separate from the side of the face. When that's all done, you can't tell that they were done separately. They all blend together really nicely. When you do that with paint, it would be very obvious which section was done separately. Well, except for oil paint. Oil paint, you can smudge the edges nicely. But with acrylic paint, you can't do that. So when you're working with colored pencils, don't feel like you have to do a base coat on the entire animal or you're going to be able to tell where you stopped and started. You won't. You can definitely do them in separate chunks and they all blend together. Even when I do portraits where it's important to have everything blend very smooth, notice how I'm able to do just the nose separate from the cheek and the chin separate from everything else. They will all blend together. You just have to keep adding more and more layers along your edges until they do look like they're all a part of the same thing. Adding brown on top of the magenta and blue. And after several more layers, I can blend that out. And pulling some of that magenta onto the forehead so that it's not just in one spot. And you can see where I've added more of the magenta on the forehead. You can still see the brush strokes or the pencil lines that I'm so used to saying brush strokes, the pencil lines that I've added under there. I didn't lose those, I just tinted the color. So I'm using violet gray and coming through and adding in some of those individual strands of fur. I've got to make very sure this is going in the right direction now. You can see that outer edge. I want to make sure that's really soft into the where it touches the background too. I don't want a harsh line in that spot. Now I went with a violet gray. Normally I would use white to add, or a cream color to add a lot of these strands of fur, but here, because this is a black animal, I need that darker color in there. I want you to be able to see that there's fur, but I don't want it to be bright white. I want it to be much more subtle. Coming back through with the black and better defining some of those spots. And even if you're working on, say, a black dog that doesn't have spots, you're still going to have areas that are darker and lighter. It's not going to be solid black. Now, the one thing that you do want to watch on an animal that is a solid color like that is that it's a good reference photo. If it's a photo where it was taken all in the dark, you're not going to see the lights that you need. So if you're looking to take commissions for pet portraits or that sort of thing, or if you're painting a horse, a dog, whatever, you've got to make sure that the reference photo is good enough that you can see the lights in the dark, that the lighting is very good. If it's taken indoors with a flash, it's definitely not, I would not work from that. And indoors without a flash sometimes can be even worse on black animals if there's no good light source. I had a lady once who was tempted to have me paint her dogs, but decided to have me do something else for her because she decided that the dogs would, being that they're black, that it wouldn't look good in art. And that is just so not true. Black animals look amazing when painted or drawn, as long as you've got good lighting there and you pay attention to that lighting. And I would say that getting a black and a white animal in your portfolio, if you are doing commissions, get samples of you doing those, because it will, so many people think that they can't have their black dog painted and have it look good. Show them examples of how good it can look. Now look at all of these details with the lights and the darks, especially around the eye there. They are so important, and it's also important that they be correct. I don't want to just put random dark shadows all over the place, because that is what determines the bone and muscular structure under the fur. if you put them in random spots and they're wrong, it'll look really weird. People may not be able to pinpoint what seems off about the drawing, but they'll know that something's not quite right. Now here, those whiskers need to be pretty dark. I actually took that black pencil and went right over them. When I blend it out with paint thinner, you're going to see that those white whiskers still stand out because the whiskers were already drawn out with white beforehand, which pretty much protected the paper from the black. If I needed those whiskers to be really white, though, I would have worked around them. You can see I didn't do too much detail on the chin, the fur on the chin there. I've got to adjust that, but I need to get this down first before I can overlap those lighter areas on top of it. And so that's why I left that chin partially unfinished. I had to do so many layers on this section under his chin and on the side of the neck to get the color dark enough and rich enough. The first several layers, even with blending with paint thinner, were coming out so dull, so I had to keep layering and layering to get that really dark. But because I'm not adding a lot of pressure, I'm able to add, I'm almost unlimited on the amount of layers I can add, especially when using Polychromos because there's no wax buildup. And that wax bloom or the wax buildup is a large part of what prevents people from being able to add too many layers. So it looks dark there until it dries. See, I'm adding brown again over my magenta color just like I did on the upper section. Now with the fur around the chin, notice that I've broken that up some. I don't want it perfectly straight going all the way around there. It's got to be sketchy so that it looks like fur. If it's too smooth, it's going to look like a cartoon. Now that I've got the darks in there, I can start coming through and better defining the fur on the chin too. I'm pulling black into it to break some of that up, and then I'll come back through with my lighter colors to pull some of the light ones that layer on over the black of the neck. You can see these gray pencils show up so well against the black, the gray luminance colors. Back to my violet gray there. Layering brown over it so that where they meet, it just kind of softly transitions between the black and the violet gray. And all that magenta I had done earlier, it looks like you can't see it that much, but you can. It's subtle. It's underneath all of those darks. My color would not be rich enough had I not put those in there first. Not that it has to be magenta, you just want another color underneath a lot of those blacks and browns so that you get that rich color. Pretty sure that little flip thing there was my phone. I must have been taking pictures at that point. I was probably comparing my image to the original. So again, on the chin, I want to make sure that I am following the direction of that fur. It doesn't all go the same direction. If you want your work to look really flat, make all of it go the same direction. Adding a red tone into the blacks there, and then coming back on top with the blacks to darken some of those areas up. You can see that the whiskers show up really nicely against the darks with the Luminance pencil. But again, they're not totally white, so if I wanted white whiskers, I would have had to have planned for that out, or planned that out earlier and left those areas white as I worked on the darks. But they didn't need to be white, so I got to be messy and just work right over them. I've blended over my whiskers, so I'll have to come back through and pull those out again later. I must have thought I was done with the neck and realized after taking photos that I was not. That happens a lot. So finally moving on to the body. This area is much, much softer. I'm not having to worry as much about the direction of the fur because you're really not going to see many fur strokes here. I want this to be pretty soft. But making sure that my shadows and my light highlighted areas are in the right portions of the body is very, very important. here you can see that pencil is not very sharp at this point, but it didn't really matter because I'm just getting solid coverage there. If I was doing little detail, I want to make sure that that pencil is sharp. And it may seem like, why do you keep saying that? Obviously you would want it sharp. I see people all the time work with really dull pencils on areas that the pencil should be sharp. So definitely pay attention to that. And bad camera angle again. Using a silver white color, I forget what it's called, it's silver something, with that luminance. I laid that down so that when I come through and blend, my light areas are still pretty light. Going on top of that with the violet gray. I'm being really, really messy. I just, again, have to make sure my lights and my darks are in the right location. If you're working on an animal that you're not really familiar with, and I've mentioned this before, but it's been a while, one of the things that I like to do, and I definitely recommend doing, go onto YouTube and find a documentary on that animal. Watch how it moves, watch how it walks, watch how the light hits it, all of that sort of thing. Learn different things. Like on here, a lot of people might not realize that black leopards have spots. They're not solid black. By watching documentaries of that sort of thing, if you're not familiar with that animal, you can learn enough that when you go through and start rendering it in your paintings or drawings, it makes it so much easier to remember to pay attention to certain details. So those documentaries can be a huge help. Even if you just watch a quick 10-minute one. I mean, just watch something to make yourself a little bit more familiar with the animal that you're going to be painting or drawing. So there is my first layer blended out with paint thinner. Again, looks like a 5-year-old drew it. Very, very grainy, gritty look there. But that will all be fixed as I layer more colors on top. I've switched over to my Luminance black for this area because I just want that soft, soft transition between my lights and my darks. And I like the Luminance better for that. But if I only had to choose one between the blacks, I could do everything I needed with the Polychromos. The Luminance just speeds stuff along, speeds it up a little bit when I'm trying to get that soft look. Of course, layering more blue into the black. There isn't a single area anywhere on this leopard where I've left black, just flat black. Every single bit has blue or red or purple or something layered mixed in with it. And even if I was doing an animal where I wasn't letting so much of the blue, like on the face, you can see I left a lot of that blue and the purple showing intentionally. Even if I didn't want blue and purple showing, I would still layer those colors into the black. The viewer isn't necessarily going to see it and see the blue in that case, but it makes the black so much richer. I'm blending that out again. You can see it gets rid of that gritty look. Some of it still shows, but it gets rid of most of it. And I'm just going to keep layering and layering until I've gotten rid of all of the gritty, grainy look. Now it is dry, so I'm going back over it again. That is the violet gray. Now these highlighted white areas, I want them to be bright, but I don't want them to be white. So that violet gray is just perfect with the highlights on a black animal. And this is where it's really important too for me to make sure that my edges are nice and clean. So that it doesn't look like a messy halo around my subject. You can see my pencil's still not sharp, which is okay for this section. And my third time blending that out with paint thinner, I think, unless I counted wrong, which is possible. When doing something like this, I do recommend looking at more in terms of abstract shapes, correct abstract shapes, copy your reference photo, but all of that looks like just a mess of color. If you're trying to go, okay, here's the shoulder and I'm drawing a shoulder now, it won't make sense. Just copy the abstract shapes that you see on your reference photo when you're doing something like this, because there isn't a lot of detail. It's hard to see what's what. Just copy it, look at it as those shapes. An easy thing to do is to turn it upside down and work with it that way, or work on it that way. Again, I still can't talk, but that will force your brain to see the shapes as shapes instead of seeing them as here's a shoulder, here's an arm, here's whatever. It definitely can make things go much easier for you. Because if you were to just cut out that back shoulder thing, you would have no idea what this is. I would never guess that was part of a leopard. But as a whole, it all makes the same, that one piece. So having your darks in the right place and your lights in the right place are extremely important still. I recommend the same when doing things like mountains, where you've got the snow-capped mountains. Those are just a mess of shapes and it can get really overwhelming. Turn it upside down and look at it as an abstract shape instead of thinking, I'm drawing a mountain, and then getting frustrated because it doesn't look like a mountain as you're doing it. Now I've switched over to my Polychromos black because I want to get it even darker. And I find that the Polychromos black does get a little bit richer than the Luminance. But I'm mostly putting that on the darkest areas now. And blending that out with paint thinner again. And at this point, my goal isn't so much to cover the tooth of the paper. Earlier on, I'm getting rid of the grit of the paper. That really isn't an issue here. Here, I just want all of these colors to slightly smudge into each other so I get that soft look. Now, normally I will pull in whatever colors are in my background into my subject. Here, I kind of did the opposite. I went back through and pulled some of those red browns into my background to pull them together that way. I don't like to pull green into my subject, almost ever. It is very, very rare that I want green in my subject. I just don't like the look. So to make up for that and to make sure that the leopard looked like it still belonged in that scene, I pulled reds into each other. The reds that were in the leopard, I added to my background. And that way I could avoid green altogether. If I had blues or purples or reds, any other color I would pull into the leopard instead, just not green. So here, the reference photo that I had a lot of blurry greens in it from a leaf that was in front of the shoulder, which didn't look right for my piece. So this is where I want to find another reference photo of another leopard or a video of a leopard so I can see what that area is behind the leaf, which was its shoulder and part of its arm. Most of it was able to be just filled in with black with very, very little shading over it, but being able to go on and look at another reference photo on here, because the reference was being used as a reference photo, not to copy exactly, I don't have to worry about copyright. I can just find any photo of any leopard that I want to use to see what that shoulder would look like. Now, I can't do that to copy the entire leopard, but for a small area like that, it is no problem at all. You really don't have to worry about it then. This reference photo comes from wildlifereferencephotos.com if you want to see what the changes that I made in mine, or if you want to draw it yourself. Again, adding more blue over my blacks and magenta. I want to soften that up, so I'm using my black Luminance pencil. Blending that out again with paint thinner. At this stage, I don't need quite as much paint thinner on the brush, but because of this being an animal and it doesn't matter if things are perfectly smooth, I don't need to worry if I've got too much. I'm not looking for as smooth of a finish as I would on a portrait with skin. Oh, my last time adding in whiskers. And that is about it for this guy. And you will see I went back through and hyped up my purples and my blues quite a bit once I was finished. The reason for that was when I took the photograph and put it into Photoshop, I did a little editing on it and realized I really liked the richer tones I came up with in Photoshop. So I went back to my original and I took a purple and a blue Polychromos. I went with Polychromos on that, not Luminance, because I wanted it to be very translucent. That way I could just kind of wash the colored pencil over those areas without losing any of the detail that was underneath. All I was doing was brightening up those colors, just making them, pulling them out a lot more. So that is it for this guy. If you have any questions, let me know. It's best if you ask here on Patreon because I'm able to keep a closer eye on Patreon questions, so I try to get to you guys first. But that is it, and I will see you guys next week for another colored pencil tutorial, that one with an airbrushed background.